So, hello everyone and welcome back. You are watching the DotVVM virtual conference, the second day, and this is also the second presentation for today. And even after this, there will be two more, so there is still a lot to be looking forward to. And my name is Andrej. I'm one of the developers for the DotVVM project, and in this presentation, I'll be talking to you about validation improvements and our plans for the upcoming versions regarding the validation. So, validation. In DotVVM 4.0, we actually did a bunch of work on validation. Actually, I would say we basically rewrote the whole thing and the way it internally works. I mean, it's not that observable from the API that users use, but the way it works internally is now basically completely different. So let's take a look at it. But first, let me just briefly recap on how validation worked in versions 3.x, so that we can better appreciate what's new in this validation subsystem. So, validation in .vvm 3.x, when it comes to creating validation errors, there were basically three options. The first, the most common and the most encouraged options is of course to use our automatic validation mechanism. So how does this work? So I'm pretty sure that most .vvm developers are familiar with it. So you can use it, for example, by writing a required attribute on some of your properties. And during validation, for example, on postback, we will check that this constraint of your holds so that the property was actually set and has some meaningful value. So this is one way on how validation errors can be generated. So for example, if you have this required property and it wasn't set, you would get a validation error. So what's the other alternatives? So you can, of course, also create validation errors manually. And you can either do it using a compile time safe API by providing a lambda function that points to a property that is in violation where those validation errors should be attached to. And this is also perfectly fine to do because based on some backend logic that you have on your running on your server, you may discover that something is not right and you need to attach some errors manually. And the third option that was available for users, which was not really common and for good reasons, is to write property paths manually. And this was really cumbersome in the previous versions because it required users to write knockout expressions, which means that we were leaking a little our internal implementation on how this validation system works. And they were also pretty hard to write sometimes, as I'll be showing you on the next slide, where I'll be comparing it to the new approach. And also, so these are the three options that were available for you when creating validation errors. Mostly there, I mean two, but the second we can distinguish whether you use compile time safe API or you were using these unsafe knockout handwritten expressions. And what was the next important thing about validation was validation scopes, and the way you determined the scope of validation is by setting validation targets. So if you, for example, you have a very big view model and on your page you are working with its small subsets. So for example, a user is currently filling out a form. So you would naturally set the validation target only for that smaller part of viewmodel, because that's the part that you want to actually validate only. And in the recent versions, you were not able to create any errors outside of this validation scope. It just wasn't possible. So now that I shortly recapped how validation worked, let's have a look on how we improved it. So the first big and important improvement is that we are no longer using these old and not really nice knockout expressions when expressing property paths. If you are wondering and never saw this, how did they actually look like, you can see them in this short code example that I prepared. This old format of property paths is expressed with this red color. You may notice there are so many parentheses. That's because we need to, since we are using knockout, we need to unwrap individual observables until we get to the target property that we want to assign a validation error to. So this is not really nice to write nor to read. So we basically, the new property path format that we are using right now, you can see in the lower part of the code sample. I think we can all agree that it's much nicer, human-readable, and it has some other important features as well. It is unambiguous because those paths are always expressed from the root view model, so there is no ambiguity whether this is just a relative path and what is the context that we should evaluate this path on, and so on. So we basically redid how this works. You actually don't need to, of course, write these paths, but it's really helpful to at least have some sense on how they actually look like and what do they mean, because as I'll be showing you on later slides, we are right now showing these property paths whenever displaying validation errors to users, because they are now pretty nice, easily readable, and can help you to identify the root cause of validation issues much faster. So if I was to look at this example that I prepared here, what does this lower property path actually means? So you may immediately notice that it starts with a slash. This means that this path is rooted, and this means that it's basically starting from the root view model. And in that context, it also means that in the root view model, there needs to be a property called users collection. So yeah, probably a list or an array. And we found out that we want to attach an error to its first element. So that's why there is this 0, because there is an issue with the first user inside of the collection. And in that object, there must be a property called post, and it must have a child property called post text, and this is something that we are attaching the error to. So it's basically just a way to describe the path from root view model to the target violating property. So that's what these new property paths actually mean. So, okay, this is pretty nice. What else changed? So, validation targets overriding. So, as I previously mentioned, In .vvm 3.x, you were not able to override validation targets. Well, now you can. You can manually add a validation error, but of course, this does not apply to the automatic validation. So this doesn't break anything. The automatic validation is always respecting the validation target. But for example, if you decide that regardless of the fact that you have set a validation target and would really need to set also validation error, for example, to the root view model, you can do so since .vvm 4.0 because this is also supported. So new property paths and overriding validation target when manually adding validation errors. So what is the next change that we did? So we also improved API for creating and adding errors to model state. So you can now specify validation errors based on more complex requirements. There are new overloads that you can take advantage of. And if you are wondering how it actually looks like, I prepared a small code sample. So there are many overloads on validation error factory. So for example, here is one, add model error that takes a view model reference. So for example, I am passing here a reference to a form view model that can be nested somewhere on some path that is reachable from our root view model. And then from this form view model, I want to attach the new error to its ID property. So we are basically saying that there is something wrong with the ID, and then of course the descriptive error message. So as you can see, you can basically provide two parameters. You can set an object that should be automatically found by .vvm. So internally, .vvm will basically resolve the path from the root view model to the form view model. And if this is reachable, if the object is reachable, then we know that the validation error should be attached to that object. And then we will just concatenate it with this path that you provided using the lambda function, and we get the whole absolute property path from root view model to the validation, to the violating property. So this is just a single example, but there are many other overloads, simpler ones and also a bit more complex ones, so that you can express many errors with ease. And basically we think that we covered all possible use cases with this new API that we introduced. So yeah, and the important thing that I briefly mentioned but haven't talked much about, whenever you are adding, manually adding these errors, we will perform a reachability analysis. So for example, what it means that in this case, the form view model needs to be reachable from the root view model. And if it's reachable, the error will be added to the model state. If it's not reachable, we will determine that, okay, there is an error, but the error is not referenced from the view model, so we are not showing it to user because it's just not there. So even if you make a mistake by referencing something that is not reachable, it won't be a trouble. We just wouldn't find the path and would discard the error. So yeah, validation improvements when it comes to the new API and reachability analysis. This is also another important improvement when it comes to validation. And as I've been saying about those property paths, we are now displaying them also to users. So for example, if there are some validation errors sent to the client, or basically displayed in the JavaScript console for any reason, you would now get not only the error message, but as you can see, there is also this property path, which basically in this case is telling us that at root viewmodel there needs to be a property called detail, and this property has a child property called name, and that's basically the violating property. So we believe that this addition can be helpful when analyzing what is the root cause of your validation problems. So whenever, for example, in this case, a postback is cancelled due to some validation errors, you would also get these property paths so that you can basically just straight go and inspect the view model at that specific place to know what went wrong. Because these error messages on their own are not that great at describing what is the actual place inside a view model that has been violated. So I think that this is also a great addition. And lastly, I would like to talk about one more addition that is not yet available, but will be available in .VVM 4.1, and that is that we are adding a JavaScript API for modifying errors. Now, I am not really expecting that many users will be using this API, but it is nice that it is there, because it is also laying the groundwork for us for our future work that I'll be talking a bit later about, that we want to perform a validation also during static commands. So just a brief overview so you know what we are working on internally. Just a few days ago, we basically added two new functions. One that can be used to add new errors inside when working on client side, and also another method called remove errors that can be used to basically detach all errors on a given property or given properties. So yeah, this is also a pretty exciting change, although apart from those previous ones, I'm not really expecting many users to use this one, but it's also important that it is there. So these were the validation improvements that we did. I mean, the most important changes that we did for validation in .VVM 4.0. And now let's take a look at what does this mean for you when you are upgrading your older applications, for example, from .VVM 3.x, and what breaking changes are there basically. So as I've been saying, there is this new property path format, but unless you actually use the API where you would manually write those knockout expressions, you wouldn't be affected by this change at all. It's just an improvement, so whenever you now see validation errors, they will get these nicely readable property paths. So model state is now immutable. That is the next breaking change. In order to create new errors and have them attached to the added to the model state, you need to use our API. There is no way around that. We needed to keep the model state consistent so that we can make some further changes. But yeah, I mean, those factory methods have been around for quite some while, so unless you've been manually changing model state, which I don't believe is quite often, you wouldn't be affected by this either. The next breaking change is that viewmodel validation error, our class for holding validation errors, is immutable as well. But yeah, I don't really believe that that many users were actually changing those errors once they were made by our factory methods. So this shouldn't be an issue for many users as well. And lastly, we introduced a new method called addRawModelError, which can be used if you want to add new validation errors based on a handwritten property path. And this method is only accepting the new format, the new nice readable format, not that old, quite cumbersome knockout expressions. So yeah, if you were using manually handwritten paths, you just need to use this different overload. But yeah, I mean, that's basically all. So if you were basically relying on automatic validation and you have been using our API for adding manual errors, I mean those various factory methods, you shouldn't have any troubles updating whatsoever. But it's still helpful to keep these changes in mind in case something happens during your upgrade process. So yeah, I mean that's basically it for validation improvements and the validation breaking changes. And right now I would like to briefly outline what is coming next when it comes to validation in future versions. So some of it might come in 4.x or even 5, I mean the next major version. So there is not really a strict time when this will be available, but we have already a pretty clear idea on how to implement these new features. So let's take a look at what you can expect in the upcoming .vvm versions. So the most important thing when it comes to validation that we want to implement as a new feature is validation for static commands. So validation for static commands is something that hasn't been available in .vvm, and regular validation has been around since its very early versions. And in order for us to implement validation for static commands, it has to work in a bit different way. So when we introduce validation for static commands, the biggest difference will be that it won't just validate viewmodel. It will be validating the arguments that are passed to the static command invocation. So if you think about it, those things that you were able to specify for validation, so for example Validation.Enabled or validation target, these won't be applicable to validation in static commands. These will, however, still stay there functioning for regular validation, for example, whenever you are doing postback, because you can still disable validation for some parts or basically delimit the scope of validation by setting a validation target. But this is something a bit different as to what we will be doing with the static command validation, because we will be validating only arguments. So what does this mean? So for example, we will be adding new factory methods for validation errors, such as in this example, add command argument error, where we will be describing which argument is being violated, and then, for example, an error. Of course, there will be more overloads. For example, if you want to attach the error actually to some child property of the argument, there will be a lambda expression. There will be even probably a way for you to describe handwritten paths if you feel like you need that. And yeah, I mean, it will be really similar, but you will be attaching these errors not really to viewmodel, but you will be attaching them to individual arguments. And you may be asking yourselves, okay, this is interesting, but we are still attaching these errors only to arguments. I mean, how will this reflect to my viewmodel? Because we now have already existing systems, already established mechanism for attaching validation errors to individual properties inside your viewmodel, so you can do some further operation whenever there is an error attached. So of course we will try to reflect these validation errors based on the paths or the expressions that you provided to us, to map them or match them against the viewmodel. So we can of course do this for most cases, because in our experience, whenever we are doing command invocations or static commands invocations and passing arguments, people usually tend to put individual properties as arguments, which is quite common. But you can also write there some more complex expressions. And what we are basically trying to say is that when you provide us with this validation error for your argument, we will basically recalculate this path and try to match it to that absolute path inside your viewmodel, so that the error will be attached in the same way as you are used to right now. I mean, of course, there are some limitations. So for example, if you take a look at this code snippet that I wrote here, you may see that there is a more complex expression. So for example, we may write a static command that would take a string name property, and we may write there this conditional ternary operator that would, based on some logic, decide whether to pass their property A or property B. But this is quite problematic, because when we find out that this argument is in violation with your defined contracts, we would not be really able to easily match this to a property, because we are not really sure which property was actually used for the invocation. And I mean, we will try to do our best to implement this in such a way that common expressions will be matched. Those properties used in those expressions will be matched to your viewmodel, but it will be probably the case that with many complex expressions, it wouldn't be really feasible to try and match them, and some cases might be even too hard to even try that. So, but for the most part, what I'm trying to say, we will be matching these validation errors against the viewmodel as people are used to. So there will be just new API. You will be assigning individual errors to arguments instead of directly viewmodel, and we will take care of the rest. We just have to come up with a best way on how to basically enable the validation for static commands, because since it hasn't been around since earlier versions of DotVVM, just turning on static command validation by default could be considered a breaking change for many users. So there will probably be a global setting of some sort where you will be able to turn the validation for static command on or off. But yeah, that is yet to be determined. But I'm guessing that for new project, it should be turned on by default, as once this comes out, it will be a really nice feature, because then we would have a really nice working system, validation system, both for commands and also for static commands. yeah, so that's the brief overview that I wanted to show you. And just to conclude this presentation, since .vvm 4.0 we did a bunch of work on validation, basically rewrote the whole thing, and now it works, in my opinion, a lot better. Property paths are human readable and ambiguous. They do not leak our internal implementation, and I mean are nice to look at and easier to write. So yeah, I mean that's really nice to have, of course. And we are now supporting, since .vvm 4.0, some more advanced scenarios. For example, you can manually attach errors outside of your defined validation scope by set validation targets. So you can basically override this behavior. If it, of course, doesn't affect the automatic validation, but whenever you are manually adding errors, you are now able to override this behavior, if you choose to do so, of course. And improvements on client side is another important stuff that we did. We are displaying more descriptive errors in JavaScript console, and we are also introducing a JavaScript API for working with errors that will be coming in the upcoming versions. So, and of course, as I described on the 2 previous slides, we basically finalized our technical roadmap for validation in static commands. We have a pretty clear picture on how to implement this thing, and so you can be looking forward to it in the upcoming versions of .vvm. So at this point, I would like to thank you for your attention. This will be all from me for this presentation. However, after this, there will be also 2 additional presentations with great speakers. So yeah, there is a lot to be looking forward to. So until then, stay tuned, and thank you for listening, and have a nice day.